Hello, welcome back to Green the Grid and Electrify Everything. My name is Cal Truman, and I am the Education and Careers Coordinator for New Yorkers for Clean Power. You have made it to the electricity video, and I'm excited to have you because this is probably my favorite section of the presentation. I find it very interesting because it's kind of a complicated problem. How do we take the electricity system we're relying on now and make that electricity come from a lot more places and a lot more kinds of technology and just diversify it and spread it all out? How are we going to do that? We've got some answers for you. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Here we go. Great. Excellent. So far we've talked about electrifying everything, electrifying our buildings, electrifying transportation. So now we're gonna get into greening the grid. We finally made it. Electricity is responsible for about 13% of emissions in New York State. And I promised you there wouldn't be too many graphs in the presentation. This slide and the next are the last of the graphs. You've done it, you've made it. So this is a snapshot of where the electrical grid was at in New York State in 2020. All right, let's see. So at the top of the presentation, I mentioned the state had targets of getting to 70% renewable electricity by 2030, which when I'm recording this, that's less than 8 years away, and 100% zero emission by 2040. So I've got these targets down here just so we can keep them in mind. So the green is renewable energy. We've got hydro here in this lightest green, wind power, and then other renewables include solar, but it's not only solar. There is so little solar in the state that it doesn't even get its own category. And then purple is nuclear. So statewide, if you look at the whole of New York, we're currently at 28% renewable and 57% zero emission. So zero emission is the renewable plus the nuclear, because nuclear's environmental impacts do not include greenhouse gases. So please note that most of this energy is coming from a few large hydropower dams like Niagara Falls and our 3 remaining nuclear facilities. So, 28% renewable, 57% zero emissions, that's okay. There are worse places. That's a fine starting point, right? We've got work to do, but that's a fine starting point. However, looking at the state like this does not give you the whole picture. I'm going to break it down into 2. So we talked about the electrical grid early in the presentation. That's the equipment that supplies and moves electricity throughout the state or any region, but in this case, we're talking about the state of New York. There happens to be congestion in the grid around Albany that makes it very difficult for electricity generated upstate to travel downstate or vice versa. So whatever's made upstate has to be used upstate, whatever's made downstate has to be used downstate, generally speaking. So essentially, we've got a tale of 2 grids. We're divided into upstate and downstate. The electrical mix of the 2 is drastically different. So let's take a look at upstate. We've got a lot of green renewables. That's very good. A lot of purple nuclear. We need to install more wind and solar. Those are still very small percentages, but we are very close to those 2030 and 2040 targets, 51% versus 70% and 92 versus 100. That's very achievable. Good job, upstate. However, when we look at the downstate grid, which is south, Albany and south, generally speaking, in particular New York City, that story is much more urgent. So the black and gray is all fossil fuels, mostly oil and gas. Dual fuel is facilities that can use either oil or gas, generally speaking. So that's all releasing. That's all fossil fuels. That's all releasing greenhouse gases. Up until 2021, April 2021, Indian Point was a nuclear facility that had been providing a lot of energy to New York City, and that was decommissioned in 2021, which is fine, but unfortunately, it was replaced by just burning more gas, essentially. So as a result, the downstate grid has gone from 31% zero emission, which wasn't great, down to only 23%. So that's terrible. And New York City in particular is relying on oil and gas for almost all of its electricity. New York City has the second biggest economy of any city in the world, so that is a huge amount of fossil fuel power, a huge amount of extraction, having to dig up or drill for these fuels, and a huge amount of emissions. It's releasing greenhouse gases every minute of every day because it's relying on fossil fuels for its power. So we've got some work to do. This is a shame. 5%, 23%. This is a shame. So we've got some work to do. Just a quick sort of, I'll call it an explanatory comma. When I'm talking about the state targets for how much solar or wind we need to install, the unit that they use and that the state uses, I mean, and that I'm going to be using is the megawatt. So to put that in context, if you think about a light bulb, an old incandescent bulb might use 100 watts of power. A new LED might use more like 10 watts. So watts are a light bulb scale of unit. When we're talking about a whole house, energy use is usually measured in kilowatts, which is thousands of watts. So 1,000 light bulbs equals, you know, a kilowatt. Well, I guess 100 light bulbs, 10 to 100 light bulbs equals a kilowatt. For a city, like a whole municipality, let's say, that jumps up to megawatts. That's the size. And a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts or 1,000,000 watts. If it's a really big city, we might measure that in gigawatts, which is even 1,000 megawatts. But generally speaking, a megawatt is the unit that we're going to be using. And that when you hear the targets, just know that a megawatt is a municipality scale unit of energy. This slide is just to give you a sense of that scale. So, all right, we talked about one of the biggest tasks for the state is to upgrade the grid in key areas so it can support upstate to downstate transmission and vice versa, as well as power dynamically flowing back and forth from, you know, stuff like buildings with small scale solar arrays. If you've got solar on your roof, you can send that to your neighbor if you're not home. And so the grid has to be able to take the energy back from you and not just send it, which is not what it was built to do. So we need to upgrade the grid around New York State. That's our first task. Or they're not in order, but like that's task 1. Task 2 is we need to install a lot of renewable energy. So now we're going to talk about how to do that. The current base of renewable energy in New York State is hydropower. As of now, the state doesn't have any particular targets for building more particularly large scale. The current energy mostly comes from a couple huge generating stations. As I said, that includes Niagara Falls, but there are over 300 smaller hydroelectric dams also generating electricity in the state. There's not a lot of appetite for building more huge hydroelectric projects. The environmental impacts are just too intense. So the potential for expanding hydropower in the state will mostly consist of electrifying existing dams that don't currently produce electricity, like they're installed, but they're not making electricity. Or the other option is installing smaller in-stream micro hydro projects. So micro hydro, these are some photos from Japan just to show how small the systems can be. Generally speaking, it's a single or a few small turbines that sit in the flow of a stream. They don't block the stream, and they produce smaller amounts of electricity without disrupting fish or, you know, chopping up lizards or anything, you know, salamanders. And yeah, you can see how small they are. They can be even smaller than that. Bard College is currently doing some really cool research into the potential for small scale hydropower in New York State. So if you'd like the link to the report that they put together, please just reach out and we can send that to you. I found it very interesting. One of the nice things about hydropower is its consistency. It provides the grid with more or less constant energy. It doesn't really fluctuate very much around the year. This is different from things like wind or solar that generate more or less power depending on the time of day and the time of year. So to give added stability for times when extra power is needed, the state has goals for utility scale energy storage, which are essentially shipping container or even warehouse sized battery facilities to store extra solar and wind for when they're needed. So you build a little bit more than you need on a day-to-day basis so that you have some extra stored for when you're not getting that energy in the time that you need it. Right now, I don't believe there are any grid scale battery sites in the state, but there's more than enough to meet that 3,000 megawatt target currently waiting in the queue to be approved for construction. So if a decent amount of those get built, we will hit this target. Now 2030, again, that's soon. So it's going to be rolling out fast. I mentioned in the the buildings and transportation videos that the technology used in the lithium ion batteries that work for home battery backup and that go into electric vehicles are sometimes also used for grid scale storage. The nice thing about grid scale storage is it's a little more flexible because frequently you'll be storing energy for a much longer period of time. You can be storing it for months and just leaving the battery charged. For that one day, you might need to pull a little bit out. So there's actually more flexibility in the kinds of technology that work for grid scale batteries than for something that needs to be really light and get charged and discharged all the time, like in an electric vehicle. So that's a little encouraging, is that it doesn't have to be the same technology. Currently, a lot of it is, but ideally, not all of these 3,000 megawatts will have to come from the same technology that's also needed for electric vehicles and for smaller scale battery backup. So wind power is the second largest source of renewable energy in the state, although it's pretty far behind at about 3% of our current electrical generation. The first New York wind farms came online 2 decades ago, and we currently have about 2,000 megawatts of wind power installed on land. Now, the state hasn't set any targets for land-based wind power, so that will just, maybe those targets will come in the future, or maybe we will just, start installing and see how many we need before we hit our targets. However, for offshore wind, which are the turbines that are either, they can either be on floating platforms or they can be set on the sea floor, there's a target of 9,000 megawatts by 2035, which again is soon. So essentially, we're installing 4.5 times as much offshore wind power out in the ocean, presumably ocean, could also be the Great Lakes, as has already been built on land in 2/3 of the time. So this is an ambitious requirement, but it is doable. Let's take a look at this wind speed map, which is a little bit wonky, but bear with me. Let's see. The areas in red are the best spots to consider siting offshore wind farms because they've got the fastest wind speeds. So the Great Lakes have really good offshore wind potential, which would create some steady jobs in those areas, which is exciting. It's nice to bring some industry to these regions. And a lot of the companies that are helping get offshore wind off the ground, off the ocean, off the water in New York State are Scandinavian companies that have decades of experience with this. So they are building training academies with the help of the state to train up the workers that will be needed to construct and maintain all of these offshore wind facilities. So assuming that the habitats can tolerate wind turbines, these would be some good places to put offshore wind in the Great Lakes. Also very exciting, if you take a look down here around Long Island, there's very good potential for offshore wind. And if we look a little closer, oops, that is the opposite of closer. There we go. The good news is that a lot of offshore wind has already been contracted, it's already approved, and it's being installed around Long Island. So far, there's about 4,300 megawatts permitted in this area, which is almost half of the Climate Act target. So if they all get built, we will be well on our merry way. And they are power, the electricity they make will go directly towards powering New York City and that dirty downstate grid with clean energy. It's also a lot of new energy jobs. We're talking 10,000 jobs in offshore wind statewide. So SUNY, which is the State University of New York, and NYSERDA, which I mentioned in a previous slide, but that's the New York State Renewable Energy, no, it's a hard acronym. But anyway, it's the clean energy branch of the New York State government. They together just launched the Offshore Wind Training Institute to get that workforce up and running. They've purchased land for it on Long Island. It's being constructed. So there's a lot of work to do on the wind power front, but we are making really good progress. So wind power is one of the places that we've got some really exciting work underway. And there's reason for optimism, which is kind of rare in climate conversations. Oops. Okay, in third place, a very distant third place for renewable energy production in the state, we've got solar. which is maybe the one people feel like the most familiar with because the components of solar are so scalable. You use the same pieces to make a small array, next to a building or on top of a building as you would to make a huge, field or warehouse roof of solar panels. It's the same pieces, you just need more of them. And so people tend to see these more often. The requirements for where you put it are pretty flexible. So we refer to solar on two general levels. The state does, and so I also do. The first is distributed solar, which when you think about, your neighbor's got solar panels on the roof, that's what that means. That's distributed solar. It makes enough energy for the site it's on and not much more. The second is grid scale or utility scale solar. And that usually means very big solar arrays working more like a power plant to supply the whole grid with electricity. So, these solar panels are not here to power this field. They're here to power the grid. They're going to send energy to any buildings in the surrounding area that need it, rather than specifically supplying the place that they're located. This photo is actually of a solar farm on a capped landfill in Ulster County. So that's a great example of using space that's not really good for much else as a site for solar panels. Really briefly, just so that you know what it is, in between distributed and utility scale solar, there's a product called community solar. And I mention this just so you know it exists, particularly if you are a renter, because there's no targets for community solar. It's more just something you should know exists. It uses a centralized solar array, which could be in a field, it could be on a roof, but someone installs a bunch of solar panels. And then those solar panels serve the needs of specific individuals rather than the whole electric grid in general. So if you look at this picture, someone from the company that provides community solar will take a look at your electric bill. They'll say, okay, over the course of a year, you use this much electricity. It would take 12 solar panels to make that much power. So you're going to essentially pay us a subscription fee for these 12 panels, and all of the electricity they make gets sent to your electric bill as credits. So you get a discount on your electric bill, and your electricity is being essentially provided by local solar energy. You're not literally getting those electrons from the solar panels delivered to your house. It's done through billing, but you're supplying the electric grid with all of the solar energy that you would need to run your house. So it's a wash, and you save about 10% on your electric bill over the course of the year, which is terrific. I know where I live, we have a utility that has been messing up people's electric bills, which has been making community solar more confusing. And it's worth noting that this is not the fault of the community solar providers, it is the fault of the utility company. So be aware that that may happen. But community solar is kind of a special case, and it's an important way to make renewable energy accessible to more folks. So I wanted to make sure to mention it before we got into solar targets. You can subscribe to community solar if you are a renter. Sometimes you can keep your subscription when you move. They'll just compare your energy use to see if you need more or fewer panels. If you live in a house with a lot of shade and you don't want to cut down all your trees, which would be, not ideal, you can get community solar instead of trying to install it on your house where there's too much shade. So it's great for accessibility. And again, you do save that 10% on your electric bill, which, especially with the price of energy right now, is great. You're helping make local solar jobs. I encourage it. All right. Distributed solar. The state has set targets of 6,000 megawatts by 2025, tick-tock, that's coming right up, and 10,000 megawatts by 2030. Right now, we've got about 2,500 megawatts. About 15 kilowatts as an average home size system, which is, I think that could be the average. That would mean solarizing about 500,000 additional homes by 2030. Fortunately, we've got somewhere between 6 and 8 million buildings in the state of New York to choose from, and 600,000 homes in New York State already have solar, so we know it's feasible. Also worth noting that a lot of this distributed solar can be for commercial operations. So it could go on a warehouse, it could go on an office building, it could go on shops, things like that, which have much bigger electrical needs and would mean fewer installations overall. A couple of favorites for me are car washes, auto mechanics, those kinds of places that need a lot of power. Great spots to put solar panels. There are no state targets for utility scale solar, similar to the land-based wind. Maybe they will get set in the future. They don't exist yet. So instead, I will address some of the anxieties that come around utility scale solar. Generally speaking, the concern is that we're going to use up all of our prime agricultural land on solar farms, or we're going to clear cut forests to make way for them, and it's going to totally devastate our food system and the natural world. Neither of those things needs to happen. So we it's a sort of a separate question to talk about acreage. I had a piece about that in the presentation, but it turned out to just be more confusing rather than more clarifying. So I've removed it. But I do want to take a second to address the amount of work that's going into keeping that from happening, to making sure that we are putting solar in places where it doesn't affect the natural spaces or the agricultural spaces of New York State unduly. So the first is a strategy called agrivoltaics. So it's agri from agriculture and volt from electricity. So it's agrivoltaics. Agrivoltaics combines crops and solar arrays, whether that's by allowing sheep grazing or cattle grazing, or in this case, goat grazing around electric panels, or solar panels. I've been told goats sometimes climb the panels, so they're not ideal. But sheep are super docile in their grazing, and then you don't have to send anybody in to mow, so you're saving gas. For cattle, it helps to raise the panels up on longer legs, which costs more, but then you're getting more dollar per acre being able to have solar there, as well as being able to raise livestock. So that's an added revenue generating source on the same land you already have that doesn't interfere with being able to raise livestock. You could also position solar panels a little less densely and grow plants around them. There are studies of doing that with nightshades and with brassicas that have shown that a certain amount of shade during the day might actually increase output. But again, those are studies. So far, they're not being rolled out commercially just yet. They're a little bit farther away than that. And then another option would be raising bees for honey in solar apiaries that are planted with wildflowers. And it's worth noting that you can find both active sheep and solar beekeeping operations running in New York State. I believe Millbrook. If you'd like to be linked to the information about that, United Solar Energy supporters in New York State put on a couple of really great webinars about pilot projects in New York State around grazing sheep around solar and producing honey around solar arrays. So agrivoltaics, that's one option for minimizing the solar footprint. Let's also keep in mind that solar is an adaptable technology that can fit in a lot of waste spaces. So there was the capped landfill. Capped landfills are a great place to put solar. Maybe floodplains that are unsuitable for housing. You can, put equipment there, but every so often the ground is too wet to have, a permanent structure. But a solar panel on stilts, it doesn't really matter. Highway medians, you see a lot of those in Massachusetts, not so much in New York State. We could be adding those. Or over parking lots, which are waste space. If you put a solar canopy over a parking lot, then your car doesn't get snow on it in the winter. What's not to love? Industrial rooftops also have the potential for both distributed solar to supply their own needs and for utility energy to the electrical grid as a whole. So if you've got a big enough roof and you're using little enough energy, you might be able to send a bunch of that power out. This is an Amazon warehouse, or a series of Amazon warehouses, really. Some big box stores in particular should be using on-site solar to supply their own energy and cut down on the amount that needs to go in open spaces. That's an incredibly easy fix. It drives me bananas to see all of these industrial roofs with no solar on them and people talking about, oh, we're going to put it in a field. Let's put it on the roofs. Let's put it in the field if we need to, but let's start, with the roofs. Let's start with the places that already have people stuff. And then when we put it in the field, let's see how many different uses we can put that field to at the same time. So we've got our agrivoltaics option, and we got our industrial rooftop option. Let's see. I have a little information about this that I wanted to make sure to share. Here we go. So it's worth noting that municipalities have the ability to tell the state or to tell developers of solar and wind, to a lesser extent, projects, where they want to host renewable energy. So most municipalities should be prepared to have to host renewable energy. Probably all of us are going to have to host some renewable energy. And so the ideal way to do that is to, on purpose, do the planning to say, okay, this is an important historical area. We don't want to put, let's go with solar. We don't want to put solar here. This is a sensitive habitat. We don't want to put solar here. This area, it's an old industrial site that's kind of fallen into disarray. No one uses the buildings that are on it. They're kind of falling apart. Maybe this is a good place to put some solar. So having those kinds of conversations preemptively can mean that if a solar developer comes to your municipality saying, hey, we would like to put some solar panels here, you can say, sounds good. We'd love that tax revenue. We'd love those jobs. Put it over there. Can you make it work over there? So Scenic Hudson is a nonprofit located in the Hudson Valley of New York, and they've put together this terrific GIS mapping tool called How to Solar Now, which walks municipalities through the process of determining, okay, which areas in the municipality are good sites for solar, and then looking at those areas saying, okay, but this one is really close to whatever historical area that we don't want to mess with that, like we want to leave that pristine. This one is, it's too close to an airport, or, we don't want the glare from the panels, whatever it might be. This site, again, we were talking, an industrial site, maybe you've got a really good spot to put some panels. Maybe you've got a field that you're like, well, it's not sensitive habitat. It would be fine to be a field that has solar panels in it. Let's talk about it. So doing that on purpose, getting out in front of that conversation, allowing for public opinions at that stage means that you don't end up with the NIMBY fights of the not in my backyard. I don't want to have to look at solar panels. People going crazy, getting their friends all riled up on Facebook. You can avoid that fight, which is not a necessary fight to have and really only serves to slow down this transition that needs to be happening as quickly as possible. You can avoid that fight by getting out in front of it, by proactively deciding, we do want solar here, build it here. So one of the most important things you can do as far as supporting the clean energy transition on the electrical side of things is to support the siting of wind and solar projects near you, in or near your municipality. And there's a great toolkit that NYCP has put together, which is free on our website, called Building Our Clean Energy Future, which is to help individuals or groups to support large-scale wind and solar projects in their area. So that is the information I have for you about electricity. I am excited about the electrical transition because it means moving away from some of the most harmful products that we could be using to power our lives and into exciting, clean new technology. And it also means spreading out the burden of hosting that technology rather than concentrating it in, low-income communities of color. We can spread it out so that everybody's hosting a little bit and everybody can do their part. So that is exciting to me. Thank you for watching this electricity-focused video as part of Green the Grid and Electrify Everything. There are 2 videos that follow this. One is a short video about waste, industry, and agriculture as the 3 remaining sectors of carbon emissions in New York State. And the final video will be about how you can get involved and accelerate the transition. So thank you again for watching, and I hope that you've finished the series, and please send me any feedback you may have. Thank you.